pacify these conflicts and to create a more consolidated, more harmonious Western Christian civilization with the Pope as supreme leader. And a very obvious way to do that was to create a new mission to gather the forces and resources of these various local potentates and these various powerful kings and mobilize them together to fight an outside enemy someplace else, and to do it under the direction and sponsorship of the church. So this was a very beneficial political move for the Pope to call for this crusade. Now, I won't get into the extreme details, but the First Crusade was an unexpected smashing success. They somehow managed to actually gather somewhere around 200,000 people and equip them and prepare them at least enough to get them there on the road to Jerusalem. And they successfully captured a large strip of territory running from the Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor down through Syria and Palestine and all the way to Jerusalem. So this is an incredible, almost miraculous success by the First Crusade. And the main reason that they succeeded, despite all the huge mistakes and, just ridiculous errors and bad ideas that came along with this crusade, they were a success mainly because the Pope's speech calling for a crusade in 1095 was met with an enormous outpouring of popular enthusiasm. Thousands of people immediately took up the cross, as they said it, put fixed cross figures to their clothes, and pledged themselves to go on this armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And word about the Pope's proposal fanned out through the countryside, through France, Germany, the Low Countries. It spread all over Christian Europe and inspired great excitement and an enormous groundswell of people, goods, resources that were thrown at this project of retaking Jerusalem. And it's a testament to the power of the symbolism of Jerusalem in the minds of medieval Christians that so many people committed themselves to this really harebrained scheme, which managed to work. Now, after that initial great success of capturing Jerusalem, the Crusaders had to set up some sort of system for ruling these domains that they'd captured in the east, or as they called it, outre-mer, overseas. And managing and defending those territories was very complicated, and the initial success of the First Crusade in part came about because they had the element of surprise. The Turkish and Egyptian powers in the Middle East that faced off against the Crusaders didn't expect, they had no idea what they were facing. They didn't expect this gigantic mobilization of thousands of people suddenly hacking their way to Jerusalem, and the Crusaders had the advantage of surprise. After 1100, they no longer have that advantage, and they face much more serious opposition from their Muslim opponents. And what we see is further crusades as popes and kings and emperors try to hold control over Jerusalem and also try to retake Jerusalem after they lose it. You see a series of mass mobilizations to the Holy Land that mostly fail. There are some partial successes. I'll talk about the Third Crusade. There are some victories here and there, but what we see overall is a gradual loss of those domains in outre-mer, permanent loss of Jerusalem, and a sort of creation of a tradition of failure, where Europeans repeatedly go out on crusade and fail to achieve their extremely ambitious objectives. But nonetheless, the Crusades are important in two ways, which I'll talk about more later. One is that they open up this tremendous avenue of encounter and exchange between Europe and the Middle East, much more than had been seen before, and a lot of ideas and practices that Europeans hadn't previously known firsthand come back to Europe as a result of the Crusades. And the Crusades become a kind of fixture in the European mind as an ideal. Crusading as an activity becomes an ideal, and it resolves a conflict or a tension that had existed before in the medieval world, where on the one hand, fighting and courage in battle were celebrated, especially as ideals for the nobility, who were the warrior class, but at the same time, violence and killing were discouraged and disparaged by the church. And the Peace and Truce of God movement had tried to resolve this tension, at least in such a way as to manage it and mitigate the damage. Still, there was this psychological tension between the warrior impulses and the pacifist impulses within European society. And crusading as an ideal allowed a kind of escape valve where people could take up the cross and they could use their skills and use their prowess as warriors, while at the same time being celebrated as pious Christians serving the cause of Christ. So crusading becomes, in this way, a sort of mental and political and economic fixture of high medieval life. Also, Northern European nobles organize and undertake military expeditions into northeastern Europe, into the Baltic region, which also come to be called crusades. So groups like the Teutonic Knights, this alliance, this sort of fraternal alliance of Christian noblemen in Germany, go out and become a kind of imperial power unto themselves by attacking, conquering, and fortifying Lithuania and the whole Baltic region, which at that time was still mostly pagan. So they're carrying out this kind of typically Germanic mission, right? Forming a brotherhood of men and going out and raiding and conquering, but they are doing so in the name of Christ. And this Lithuanian campaign also comes to be designated as a crusade, and so does eventually the reconquest in Spain. So the Crusades, by 1300, by the end of this high medieval era, you have crusades going on not only to the Holy Land, but also to the northeastern fringe of Europe in the Baltics and the southwestern edge of Europe in Spain. And all of these campaigns are all crusades in some way, and all of them are expressions of this kind of synthesis of the knightly martial ideal with the pious Christian ideals taught by the church. Okay, so these are the various directions in which Europe mobilizes itself on the military level. There is also a great intellectual and artistic mobilization. And much of the great art that we think of and that we associate with the Middle Ages and that kind of define our aesthetic understanding of the Middle Ages come from this high medieval period. So there had been some great building and architecture in the early Middle Ages, particularly during Charlemagne's reign. There is, his great Romanesque chapel at Aachen, and there are other Romanesque churches and monasteries around Northern Europe. And the Romanesque style basically followed, like the name says, it followed Roman models. It used simple curving barrel vaults, arcades, small domes, and it sort of tries to recreate the elegance, the openness, the simple symmetries of classical architecture. In the High Middle Ages, a new style arises. Starting around 1100, builders start to experiment in new forms that are not like the Greco-Roman legacy. And in particular, they take inspiration from Islamic architecture, which by this point many Europeans are seeing in Spain and in the Holy Land. And they start trying out new techniques for reaching greater heights and for creating more open and airy buildings. And in particular, they start to use peaked arches rather than the sort of smoothly curving half-circle arches that you would see in a Roman building. They start to use various sorts of peaked arches and ribbing, which can create much taller, open windows and doorways and gateways. And instead of simple barrel vaults, you start to see very complicated ribbed archways and vaults that open up greater space for windows. And this is the beginning of what we call Gothic architecture, right? So the great Gothic cathedrals begin in the High Middle Ages. We call it Gothic, but at the time the style was simply called the French style because it began in France. You see early Gothic monuments at Beauvais and Rheims, and eventually Notre Dame de Paris. And these Gothic buildings, of course, are highly, highly complex. They involve all kinds of very intricate decorative carving. This is also the age of very sophisticated and expressive stained glass art. And these are kind of among, the great lasting architectural monuments in Europe. And they are a very specific style, and you can even date a lot of these buildings remarkably precisely because of the fast-moving, fast-changing, fast-developing styles that they are getting through their experimentation and through copying and experimenting with Islamic models. The High Middle Ages also see the first flourishing of vernacular literature. So by this time, you have distinctive new languages that have arisen in all of these major countries I've been talking about. You have French, you have Italian in Italy, you have English in England, which also is constantly changing with these new Norman French influences coming in from Normandy. And whole new styles and genres of literature arise as people experiment with these vernacular languages. The biggest one, and the first one probably, is troubadour poetry. So this is a style of poetry, usually lyric poetry, that is composed in the Occitan language, which is a southern French language. People today might call it a dialect of French. It actually was very distinctive and was, properly speaking, its own language. Troubadours create a whole new sort of artistic language and set of images that often are about courtly love, about sort of fanatical, devoted love to a particular woman. It tends to be romantic. It involves, deep, passionate emotion, and it has its own sort of forms and formats of composition. And the earliest troubadour poet we know of was William, Duke of Aquitaine. So he was a nobleman. He was a duke, and he composed troubadour poems around the year 1100, maybe earlier than that, but definitely by about 1100. And this poetry flourishes among composers who often travel around from one noble court to another, especially around southern France, through the 12th and into the 13th centuries. Other great poets emerged later in the 12th century or in the 13th century, who are more distinctive and innovative than the troubadours, like Marie de France, who wrote much of her poetry in the late 12th century. She was definitely proficient in Latin, French, and Anglo-Norman, which was a sort of variation of Norman French influenced by English. And she wrote most of her poetry in Anglo-Norman. And it's possible that she was actually situated at the royal court of the kings of England, who were also dukes of Normandy. All right, remember that William the Conqueror was Duke of Normandy. He conquers England, so his successors are at one and the same time kings of England and dukes of Normandy. And Marie de France was probably attached to that Anglo-Norman royal court, although we don't know hardly anything about her. We also see, as I mentioned last time, or as I mentioned in the first lecture, the creation of universities, right? So much of the preservation and study of classical knowledge is done in monasteries and also in priories, which are sort of small monasteries of learned monks that are attached to cathedrals in towns or cities. And beginning around 1000, people who are interested in learning about law, about literature, about mathematics from these monks begin to gather at these priories in the large towns and cities. And some of them actually form guilds of students who organize themselves and regulate themselves as they study with these monks and priors. The first we know of is at Bologna in Italy. Students organize themselves and create a sort of schedule and set of routines for how they will study with these monk teachers. Many years later, in 1158, this guild of students gets a charter, and it becomes known officially as the University of Bologna. Many others follow. Okay, we have similar creations of universities in Oxford and Cambridge, in Heidelberg, in Salamanca, in Spain, and however, the most important is at Paris, which begins as simply a cathedral school of students studying with the monks attached to Notre Dame de Paris. What's a little different about Paris as compared to Bologna is that it actually begins from a guild of the teachers, right, as compared to the guild of students. So Paris gives much greater powers and much more prestige and intellectual control to the teachers, right? At Bologna, the teachers can actually tell the teachers what they want to learn and can even fire them. Whereas at Paris, it's the faculty that really has much more power. And so, not surprisingly, Paris attracts most of the great sort of leading minds and scholars in Europe and becomes the most prestigious university in medieval Europe. The universities become the hotbeds of a new style of philosophy, a style of philosophy that is extremely rigorous in its use of logic. The study of logic is fundamental. It often is extremely precise and even obsessed with fine point questions of reasoning and metaphysics and epistemology. Okay, it can be often very arcane, and it's concerned with very difficult metaphysical issues, things like the existence of God, the existence of free will, the existence of abstract concepts, the question of universals, which is more or less, are abstract concepts real or are they simply words? These sorts of difficult metaphysical questions are intensely debated by scholars at these new universities, alongside more useful fields like law and language and mathematics. This brand of philosophy comes to be called scholastic philosophy because it is the philosophy of the schools, right? The cathedral schools and universities. Arguably, the real beginning of scholastic philosophy is Saint Anselm, who is a monk who by birth is a Lombard. So he's from northern Italy, and by extraction he's a Lombard. So he comes from that, you remember that Germanic tribe that invaded Italy and had to be defeated eventually by Charlemagne. That is Anselm's ancestry, but he becomes a monk and an abbot in France, and then eventually is appointed to be Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And he puts forward a sort of logical, what he considers a logical proof of the existence of God, which at the time and over the century since then, some people have found more persuasive than others. But regardless, he sort of jumpstarts the debates and conversations over these difficult, fine philosophical points, which then come to be kind of the centerpiece of intellectual life at the universities. So scholastic philosophy in some form already began early in the 12th century, but it becomes a much more intense and heated sort of battleground in the 1200s because of the scholars' exposure to a whole new body of thought that they really hadn't had access to in the early Middle Ages. So in the early Middle Ages, the sort of dominant leading lights of philosophical thought were Plato, and they had access to some surviving books by Plato. Augustine, who I'll talk about more later, who was an early Christian theologian and philosopher deeply influenced by Plato, and Boethius. And Plato, Augustine, and Boethius, who was a Roman philosopher, all of them in different ways celebrate the life of the mind or the spiritual life and consider that to be the more meaningful and more real life as compared to earthly, physical, social, political life, which they see as sort of more base and transient. So that's the dominant way of thinking in the early Middle Ages, and I'm painting with an extremely broad brush here. It's much more complicated than this, and there are very important ideas that I'll get into later. But basically, in the early Middle Ages, you have an intellectual life that really draws a dramatic distinction between the higher life, which is mental or spiritual, and the lower life, which is political, social, worldly in one way or another. And the sort of mental and spiritual world is more important and more real than the human world. This is the mode of thinking that continues to be broadly accepted and broadly influential in the schools when scholastic philosophy begins. However, as the reconquest of Spain progresses, Christian states are able to get a hold of libraries of literature that had been accumulated and preserved by the Islamic rulers in those states. And the Islamic world really had a much better collection and a much better knowledge of the classics than the Western Christian world did by this time. They had gotten all sorts of books and manuscripts from the Middle East, from the Byzantine Empire, and they had a much larger cadre of scholars studying these Greek and Roman thinkers. the most important of whom was, of course, Aristotle. Aristotle was the most prolific and the most important and influential philosopher there's ever been. And in the early Middle Ages, Europeans knew practically nothing about him and had almost none of his texts. They had all been lost at one point or another in fires or floods or abandonment of towns. So Aristotle was hardly known at all until these Christian states in Spain, as they reconquer the country, are able to get hold of these Arabic libraries and rediscover Aristotle. And in particular, Cordoba falls in 1236, and this is the biggest Muslim stronghold. This is the great capital of the emirate, and now the Christians suddenly have tremendous access to these classics they had never seen before. And there's a kind of explosion of interest in Aristotle. These new works flood into the schools in Europe. People fall about translating them into Latin as quickly as they can, and a sort of school of thought devoted to Aristotle arises in these universities, particularly the University of Paris. And Aristotle, in contrast to Plato and in contrast to these early medieval thinkers, Aristotle puts much greater weight on observation and cataloging of the visible world. He is much more aggressive in using the senses to accumulate hands-on knowledge, and he's much more interested in social and political life. And his ethics and politics are very sophisticated. He's very interested in human nature and in how to build a strong, flourishing society from the building blocks of ordinary human life and human nature. And he takes social and political life much more seriously. So Aristotle presents this whole other philosophical point of view that is very appealing to a lot of people in this high medieval society, where you're seeing growing states, growing cities, growing trade, and knowledge of the world, knowledge of materials, knowledge of human relations, institutions, now seems much more promising and useful than it might have in the Dark Age. So what you get then is a kind of ongoing conflict between the older school of thought that was thoroughly committed to Augustine and Plato, and this new school of thought that is enthusiastic for Aristotle. And there are real differences and conflicts between these two schools of thought. I won't get into them in detail, but basically this is the situation into which a new young scholar, originally from Sicily, steps into when he, as a sort of new rising star of the academic world at the University of Paris, takes up his position, and he studies Aristotle intensely at the same time that he is still committed to the sort of Augustinian orthodoxy, and he makes it his task to fuse the two, to create a synthesis, and he is able to bring them together and create a very sophisticated theory that he believes sort of recognizes the limitations and the fallenness of human nature that you see in Augustine, but also makes room for the optimism and the belief in human capability and perfectibility that you see in Aristotle. So Aquinas is a synthesizer, and he becomes kind of the rock star of scholastic philosophy in the mid and late 1200s. He dies tragically in an accident, and slightly after he dies, a few years after he dies, his teachings actually are condemned by the church. And they're condemned for a long period of time, but eventually that ban is lifted, and since then he's been sort of recovered and revived and is celebrated again, not only as a major doctor of the church, but also he today is taken very seriously as a very sophisticated, subtle philosopher and analyst of humankind by modern thinkers. Even those who do not accept Catholicism still often take Aquinas very seriously as a philosopher. So this is that's a little bit about the intellectual scene and intellectual flourishing up through the 1200s. Things get a lot more complicated in the 1300s, in the late Middle Ages, and later scholasticism. But rather than get into that, I'll just lastly point out how this new artistic flourishing and the military mobilization came together, right? So these things were not entirely separate. The new artistry, which was very interested in linguistic experimentation, in poetry, in verse and song, came together with the militarism in the formation of a new ideal of life, right? So the martial and warrior ideals of the noble class and the knightly class was Christianized, and it was developed, it was given a new kind of moral idealism in the philosophy of chivalry, right? And chivalry, that word that we know in English, it simply comes from the French chevalerie, and cheval is horse, chevalier is a horseman, right? A warrior on horseback, and chivalry is simply the way of the horseman. And chivalry is a sort of vague catch-all term for the high ideals that people at this time attached to the way of life of the knight, of the warrior on horseback. And as probably all of you know, the chivalrous knight is supposed to be self-sacrificing, courageous. He's supposed to protect the weak and the innocent, like women, children, the old, peasants, clergy. And he's supposed to be an adventurer. He isn't just a guardian of a strategic point. He's supposed to go out and explore and find enemies to fight and find people in need of help. And this is sort of the high ideal of chivalry that flourishes in the High Middle Ages, and it is encapsulated and celebrated in the chansons de geste, the songs of great deeds, that become the sort of masterpieces of high medieval literature. So the first chanson de geste that we know of is the Chanson de Roland, or Song of Roland, which is a long epic poem about a possibly real or possibly legendary knight who fought in the service of Charlemagne against the Moors in the 700s. And the first version of the Chanson de Roland was probably written around 1040. So they start to emerge right in this high medieval period, and they sort of give life and complexity to the new image of the knight who lives by the peace of God and the truce of God, which still are pretty new at this time, right? The peace of God and truce of God were just invented in the late 900s, and they're spreading in the 1000s. Yet the Song of Roland presents this picture of a knight living by these high ideals and protecting the innocent and sacrificing himself back 300 years earlier. So the chansons de geste tend to create an idealized, romanticized past. Okay, when we think about knights today, we think of it as a romantic past because we're picturing the Middle Ages. But even when these songs were written, they were already creating stories and characters from several hundred years earlier. And so they already were creating this sort of idealized past. It's more likely that El Cid was a real person. We have documents about him. He was a knight for hire who fought on many different sides in the Reconquest in Spain. But chansons de geste were written about him probably first around 1140. And again, they romanticize him as this ideal knight in service of the cause of Christ. When, if we actually look at who he was in actual history, it was not necessarily such a romantic picture. he was a mercenary for hire. But he was a mercenary for hire of amazing accomplishments, we have to say. Now, these chansons de geste see their greatest, most abundant realization in the Arthurian romances, right? So Arthur was supposedly a legendary king of England who may have been based on a real person, and if he was based on a real person, he probably would have lived in the 6th or 7th centuries, sort of in England in the aftermath of the withdrawal of the Romans, and in this sort of period of breakdown in the aftermath of the fall of Roman Britain. However, we only have a few sort of snippet references to him in early medieval literature. The first more comprehensive account of the Arthur we know, the ruler of Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail, this sort of stereotypical Arthur that we think of, was first written about by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 1130s. So again, at the same time that these stories of Roland and El Cid are being composed, Geoffrey of Monmouth tells us this great sort of romantic story about Arthur and Camelot. And later writers, such as Chrétien de Troyes, took up that sort of explanation of Arthur from Geoffrey of Monmouth and elaborate on it and write the great epic poems that become a staple of medieval literature. Okay, now these chansons de geste, like Roland, El Cid, and the Arthurian romances, they are, as I said, they're highly idealizing. They present us this sort of extremely elevated image of the knight, or of the life of chivalry. And in Camelot, they actually give us a whole utopian society based on these chivalric ideals. But they were actually taking their own idealized self-image of their own age and projecting it into the past, right? If there was a Camelot, it was probably somewhere around 500 to 600 years before Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about it. So if there was a Camelot, it was not this chivalric world of noble heroes. It was probably a band of Gallo-Romans using force of arms to try to hold together some sort of regional state against the Anglo-Saxons. It wasn't these sort of beautiful knights in plate armor riding off and rescuing ladies and looking for the Holy Grail. But this is the image that high medieval people chose to project back into an idealized past. And a last word about these chansons de geste is that they're extremely romantic, and reading them can be pretty tedious for modern people, and they can seem like kind of just sort of delusional, sort of gauzy pictures of this perfect past. But in all fairness, they actually often had great psychological complexity as well. They were very interested in following the deeds of a particular person or set of individuals and seeing how the strengths and weaknesses of their characters play out. And part of what I think is so powerful about the Arthur legends is that they present us this very sort of golden era in this imaginary place and time, but they also human frailty and imperfection is a major force. And in the high medieval versions of the Arthurian romances, what undoes Camelot is the fact that Guinevere and Lancelot commit adultery. And in response, King Arthur is not able to deal with this betrayal without basically destroying his own kingdom. So it's really the envy, the selfishness, the animosity of these human beings at the top of this idealized world that undoes it. It's the flaws, the understandable flaws of people like Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot that are the undoing of Camelot. So these stories can be very psychologically complex and are really interested in seeing how virtue and vice play themselves out in human drama. So the picture that I've presented so far of the High Middle Ages probably largely looks pretty appealing. And certainly we do have an age of great consolidation, of new prosperity and productivity, of comparative internal peace, of artistic innovation and achievement. But as often happens, this greater internal stability in this society went hand in hand with greater conformity and intolerance. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, this is the period of time when we see more harsh, draconian laws trying to control sexuality and suppress what they considered to be sodomy, especially bestiality, which was the major sin that the church was most concerned about. And that's not surprising when you consider this was still a mostly rural society, and bestiality was probably a common sexual activity. You also see more draconian penalties against homosexuality. In towns and cities where a sort of homosexual subculture occasionally arises, you see occasional punishment and even execution. You also see a rising anti-Semitism, more frequent attacks on Jews. The First Crusade, when it launches from Germany, when those particular armies that had organized in Germany set off to participate in the First Crusade, they begin by attacking and massacring Jews, both because they see them as enemies of Christ and also because that's a source of money that they can then requisition and use for the crusade. The High Middle Ages is the time when the idea of the blood libel becomes widespread, so the idea that Jews kill Christian children in order to somehow ritually use their bodies or their blood. This spurious rumor becomes widespread and is frequently used as a way of attacking Jews. And you see more frequent expulsions of Jews. Jews are completely expelled from England in the early 1200s, I should say, and there are frequent expulsions from many parts of Europe. Jews become sort of white elephants at this time. And you also see greater policing and suppression of what the church considers to be heresy. So a new and unusual Christian school of thought called the Cathar movement becomes very powerful in southern France at the same time that the troubadour literature is flourishing. And some people have argued that Cathar philosophy and the troubadour poetry are connected. It's a school of thought that rejects all kinds of common Christian doctrines like the Trinity. It rejects the power and authority of the Pope, and it becomes very strong and popular, especially amongst the nobility in southern France in the 1100s and early 1200s. And in response, the church first tries to reconvert these Cathars to orthodoxy by preaching and persuasion. But when that fails to stop the Cathar movement, the Pope actually calls another crusade. So a further crusade is fought to suppress, to defeat these Cathar nobles, to suppress the so-called Cathar heresy. And the first large organized inquisition is set up to root out the Cathar heresy. And many people are executed, usually by burning, in order to try to end the Cathar movement. So the Cathar heresy gives us one example of the greater concern among the church and among royal governments to maintain orthodoxy, to suppress heresy, and to use force and violence to do so. So in these ways, I'll talk about all of these things more later, but in all of these ways, the high medieval society is not a utopia, not at all, but it's a different sort of society. It's a society where crowned heads, the church and the papacy all have new power and prestige, where urbanism and trade and massive building projects exist alongside a largely rural population and lifestyle. And it's one where very strong and deeply inculcated norms, Christian, chivalric, royal, really help to create a strongly consolidated civilization in Europe. And you get the stability, you get the prosperity that comes with this strong and widely embraced set of ideals and norms, but you also get the conformity and the suppression and the targeting of those who deviate from the norm. Okay, this is a trade-off that you see in all kinds of civilizations all through history, and people in Europe at this time had to face this trade-off once again. By 1300, Western Europe was starting to become something of a victim of their own successes. So I've said how crusading became a regular part of Western European life and politics, and as such it became a big drain of people and resources people kept riding off to go on crusade and promptly dying. The growth of towns and cities is a double-edged sword. It has all kinds of advantages and opens up all sorts of new possibilities, but it also started to lead to overcrowding, disease, the spread of disease and poor sanitary conditions. And you also see an increasing difficulty in feeding this large town and city population and maintaining a steady food supply to prevent food shortages or famines in these growing towns and cities. And that becomes more and more difficult, especially after 1300, when we start to see a return of climate cooling. So this late medieval warm period starts to taper off after 1300, and you're seeing longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and famines, not only in the countryside, but in the cities that depend on that huge agricultural surplus. That starts to become more and more of a frequent problem after 1300. But without getting any further into that, I'll just say that these are some of the problems looming around this otherwise flourishing society that lead to crises and even disasters after 1300, and lead to the end of what we call the High Middle Ages and the beginning of the Late Middle Ages. So that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. There will be many more. So please subscribe on SoundCloud or on iTunes. All of these should be available on iTunes. And if you like the lectures and want to see them keep coming, please go to Patreon, to my page under the same title, Historiansplaining, and become a supporter. Thank you so much.